thank you so much for being on the podcast, Jana.
Driving all the way here to
all
the
the
other
way
side of
to
town.
the other
Thanks so
side of
much for
town.
coming.
Yeah.
No, it was my pleasure. And at least on a podcast, people don't know how late I was. So
That's totally okay. So we met Jana at a Shuja's book launch. The book's called The Fall of Republican Afghanistan by Shuja. And we met there, and turns out you've got a really interesting and quite fascinating story of traveling to Afghanistan or to the refugee camps in Pakistan with your mum back when you were a kid. That's really it's very few people that we meet and actually have a conversation with that's done that from, because it's such a different spectrum, coming from the West and going to a refugee camp, especially as a kid. So did you do that? Was that one trip that you went there?
So when I was a child, it was only one trip that we went to Pakistan and Afghanistan. It was in the early 80s in 1984. So I was 7 years old. So it shows how old I am now. But it was really a defining moment in my childhood and also my life. And, as you mentioned in the introduction, I worked for the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre because of the things that I saw when I was 7 and I witnessed in that refugee camp with the invasion of the Soviet Union of Afghanistan. That really led me to do the work that I do. I've subsequently been to other refugee camps. I've been to places such as Manus Island as a processing centre, but there was one visit to the refugee camp in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but we were there for a couple of months.
Yeah, great. What you were also mentioning at the book launch was the fascinating story of how your parents actually met each other, which I think our audience would find really fascinating. Could you tell us about that a little bit?
Sure can. So my father is Italian. Yep. He was born and raised and lived in Italy, studied architecture from the north of Italy. So not typically when people in Australia think of Italians who are very sort of dark-skinned and dark-haired. In the north of Italy, it's very fair-haired, blue eyes and blonde hair. So my father was always quite radical, I think, as a storyteller, dreamer. He believed in Sufism. He converted to Islam, so from Roman Catholicism to Islam. So he was quite non-traditional for an Italian, and he travelled a lot when he was younger. So he had studied architecture, but also had a real passion for storytelling, and which led him into journalism. So in the 70s, he spent quite a bit of time travelling, and a lot of that was travelling and living in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Oh. On the other side, you've got my mum, who was born in central Victoria. Her parents owned a large farm. She's a baby boomer, so the last of 3 kids, so I think, had a lot of the privileges that last children did as a baby boomer after the war. So she came to Melbourne for school and for Teachers College, and also had a real thirst for travel. So she did an exchange program as a teenager when she was in high school, and then also jumped on a ship when she finished school and Teachers College and went travelling. So that is, the situation in the 70s that took mum and dad travelling. So it was about 1973. They were both travelling and living in Pakistan and Afghanistan. My dad loved horses. I don't know.
Sorry about that. Okay, so sorry about that. That's just my computer telling me about the timer. Sorry.
Or telling me I'm talking too much. But anyway, so
it's on 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Do you want me to,
No, all good. Continue. Yeah. Pretty relaxed, chilled here.
Yeah. So that was in around 1973, and that took them both to being travelling in Pakistan and Afghanistan. My dad loved horses, so he was sort of trading in Arab horses. My mum loved horses and horse riding, and so she was actually competing in a whole lot of horse races, but had her head tied up in a scarf because it wasn't as unusual for women to be riding horses as much. So I think my father first noticed her where they met there, and she was horse riding in a competition, and everyone assumed it was a male because the person was riding so well, and mum sort of untook her scarf and it was a woman, and dad being this dreamer was like this amazing woman on a horse. So they fell in love, and then they lived between Pakistan and Afghanistan for I think about 6 or 8 months. Then my name Jana, is, comes from the Urdu name. I mean, I think it's also in Dari and a couple of other languages, Jana, that term of endearment.
Right.
So,
John.
John
yeah.
or Jana. So my
Jana.
love, my dear,
Yes,
Jana.
yes.
So very romantic meeting.
It's like Mary Jana, in Indian.
Yeah, Indian as well. So I think it's in
absolutely.
a couple of different
That's so fascinating.
languages. So people do say,
Yeah.
where's your name from? Is it Italian? I say, well,
That's,
actually.
Because they say Jana is an Italian name, isn't it?
So actually, the letter J does not exist in the Italian language, and my name is spelt Jana. So people assume it's either Gianna, because GI in Italian, or Jana for Eastern Europe. So I'm constantly having to say, no, it's Jana with a hard J, because it actually comes from Pakistan. Yeah, so it's
wow.
On your LinkedIn, actually, you know how you've got that microphone or that
yeah.
speaker next to your name? I clicked on it and it says Jana with a hard J. I'm like, okay, Jana, it is.
Oh, you pre-recorded that, did you?
yes, I had to, because everyone says Jana.
Yeah.
Actually, I was on a panel this week and I said to someone, he kept calling me Jana, and I said, it's Jana with a hard J. And he said, oh, Jana with a hard J. And I said, no, Jana. That's why I've recorded that.
But your mom, the way your mom and dad met, is very much similar to this Bollywood movie, Khuda Gawah. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't. But
It is also set in Afghanistan.
Oh, wow.
And the movie starts with a horse racing competition, Buzkashi. So a traditionally male-dominated sport, but there's a woman racing there as well, and same thing happens. They meet there. But anyways, maybe I'll send you a link to that movie.
Great.
Yes.
That movie would have been recorded around the 70s, 80s as well in
Yes.
Afghanistan.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, I think it was a big hippie trail as well.
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
I don't think it's so unusual that people from other countries or from the Western world were there. But mum and dad, they fell in love with each other. They fell in love with the country. They fell in love with the people.
Yep.
And they, we have had people from Afghanistan in our lives over the decades throughout because of the bond that they formed between each other there.
Yeah.
They went to Italy, they got married in Italy, and then for the first time my dad set eyes on Australia was after they were married, and he moved to Australia. So that was sort of the start of their journey together and them meeting. So Afghanistan has featured, regardless of my experience of being there when I was younger, which I'm sure we'll get to in a minute, but the Afghanistan being a really formative part or something that I was aware of from a really young age was because that's where my parents met, and it's a big part of our life.
Your relationship you were mentioning with Afghanistan in general, and did that have anything to do with your line of work in terms of the refugee asylum seeker work that you currently do?
Absolutely. I think it had to. It's been something that I think was very formative for me. I mean, I grew up in a small country town in central Victoria. I can't imagine that I would have been as aware of refugees as an issue in particular for people from Afghanistan if it wasn't for that experience. And personally, so after mum and dad met, married, came to Australia, had 3 kids, and then in the late 80s, it was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. As you said, that really changed the country so much because they were invaded by this foreign force, and everything that was to be from Afghanistan was further persecution. Like they were being targeted. It was a war. And Dad wanted to put a spotlight on what was happening in Afghanistan because not a lot of people outside Afghanistan knew what was happening.
Yeah.
It's called the Forgotten War for a reason.
Absolutely.
So Dad travelled from us living in central Victoria back and forwards to Afghanistan and Pakistan in the late 70s and early 80s, wanting to put a spotlight and use his filming on what was happening. He also tried to set up the first ever live satellite cross from Afghanistan into the Western world to try and show what was happening with the war. So he was there filming the documentary, and unfortunately,
this is during the war.
This is during the war, absolutely during wartime. So this was in from 81 to 83.
Yep.
And then towards the end of 1983, on the last day of filming, he was actually killed. So we were in Bali at the time because we'd gone to Bali and he was going to meet us, having been away for a couple of months. And unfortunately on that last day, he was killed. He wanted to get as much footage as possible, and so the camera was actually rolling when he was killed. And mum decided, she just had this feeling, she said once found out that Dad had been killed, that to honour his work and to honour what was happening in Afghanistan, she wanted to finish the film. So she took me, my brother and my sister into Pakistan first, because it was a war zone in Afghanistan, to A, try and recover his body, and B, wanting to finish the film. So, back to that original question of yours around, is that why I do the work I do today? I mean, absolutely. The things that I witnessed when I was in Pakistan and then in Afghanistan are what drive me today, because I vividly remember going to the refugee camp in Pakistan where people from Afghanistan had fled, mainly women and children. They were given, rations of food, and I just remember them counting like each grain of rice because they hardly had any food. And secondly, we were 3 little blonde kids, and we went into the refugee camp. And the first thing I remember is other kids seeing us and screaming and running away. And the reason they did that was because we were blonde.
Looks so different.
And the only other blonde people they'd seen were Russians who were killing them, and so they were scared of us. So even at that 6 and 7 years old, I was really aware that one person can scare someone else so much that we can create harm to each other. And that just always stuck with me, that people don't choose to be refugees, they don't choose to seek asylum, they're forced to because they're targeted and persecuted by someone else. It's not just a policy, it's not just a government, it's someone behind those decisions who are choosing to intentionally cause harm to someone else. And that is what I've always carried with me. I'm so lucky. I was born in Australia. I have Australian citizenship. Through my dad, I have Italian citizenship. So I have 2 passports, 2 citizenships. There are 100 million displaced people in the world at the moment who probably don't have passports or citizenships. Whereas I've got 2, I'm so lucky. And so I always wanted to use that privilege to be able to advocate for and alongside with other people. And, the fact that I can vote in a country, so I want to use my vote in that way. I have a voice with no repercussions. So that's definitely why I do the work that I do today with that real sense of social justice, and feel that anyone who's in a position to change things should do it. So I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but absolutely. In the 1988 federal election that John Howard was running in, wanting to be Prime Minister, he happened to visit Maryborough, the small town that I was in, and, I was this little blonde kid, so I pushed my way to the front and I asked him a question. It ended up being recorded and was broadcast. And I said, if you get elected, what will you do for refugees from Afghanistan? So even at that age, when I was 10, I was already asking questions.
Conscious of it,
and conscious of it. And that's because of my that experience that I had as a child, because of my parents. We lived in Maryborough, but whenever we came to Melbourne, as much as I hassled Mum to go to McDonald's, she would take us to the Afghan Gallery in Fitzroy instead, and we would eat food from Afghanistan. We would go to weddings of people from Afghanistan. So it was sort of part of my upbringing.
That's just fascinating.
It's quite admirable as well. The reason that you're doing your work is not so much to have a career, but there is an underlying reason or philosophy behind it as well. I wish I had that.
You've got a great inspiration in your dad too. I think it just also shows for me how much, for me, my experiences were shaped by my parents, and the admiration I have is really for my mum. Like, she was a single mum, 3 kids underage.
We met her at the
into a war zone. You met her. She's also a force. Like, she's a strong woman, but she then put aside any career for herself to then just make her whole life about us as well. So I've got an incredible role model to also look up to in terms of being strong. And I am sure there were a lot of people telling her, like, don't you dare take 3 kids into a war zone.
A war zone, absolutely.
And she did, because she knew it was the right thing to do. And she finished the documentary. Unfortunately, we were unable to recover Dad's body, but we did get smuggled into Afghanistan. So we got footage in Afghanistan.
What memories do you have from Afghanistan from that age?
I have memories of, we had to get smuggled across the border in a ambulance because there was no other way to get across, because a lot of checkpoints. And so the ambulance, I remember, kept breaking down. That while my brother and I and my younger sister, as I mentioned, because we were scaring people because we were so blonde, Mum actually dyed our hair black and rubbed dirt in our skin so that we wouldn't look so visibly foreign. And I remember that vividly, because I was, what's going to happen to my hair? Mum was like, don't worry, in the bazaar they told me it's temporary. Well, it was permanent. So I remember we had our hair dyed, being in the ambulance. There was a Russian tank that had been captured by the Mujahideen. So we were in the tank, like seeing what the tank was like. I remember the Russians were dropping bombs, and they called them butterfly bombs because they looked like toys, and they did that on purpose.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah, they dropped them on purpose so that either kids would pick them up and then get maimed or injured, or adult men would as well. And that would then meant that if kids were injured, the parents would stay at home to look after the kids. So they were that was a way that they could reduce the, capacity of people from Afghanistan to fight. So I remember seeing those bombs. I remember seeing men who had their legs blown off. I really vividly remember just the generosity that was shown towards us by everyone in Afghanistan. And I mean, most of them were the Mujahideen, freedom fighters at that time. Like people had really loved my dad, and they extended that to us as well. So on the one hand, witnessing the horror of war through bombs, but then on the other hand, this generosity and hospitality that people were literally fighting for their lives, but they still would sit down and offer us tea and offer us food.
Yep.
Yes, and I can feel emotional but it was just, you saw the best and worst in humanity, and I remember that even as a 7-year-old that I could tell.
That's just amazing. In terms of and it's a really sad story about your dad, but where in Afghanistan do you know that he would have been around that time? Like which part of Afghanistan?
Which province?
Province. Oh, I should have prepared myself, because I know that I've asked my mum this previously and she's told me, but that's why I'm terrible on the details. You might have to put it in your blurb in the podcast after, because I've got it written down, but I always do.
Yeah, no worries.
So, but thinking about it from a pragmatically at the moment, as an adult who's got kids and everyone, and is a responsible parent, not suggesting that your mom wasn't a responsible parent, but do you sort of think back about that and sometimes go like, what the hell were you doing? Taking us kids into a war zone. I understand that there's a greater philosophy behind that for the greater good of the people, and how much you want to go and help the people. In addition to that, there's the motive to recover your dad's body as well. So that's a huge driving force as well. Do you sometimes sort of think that, it's very fortunate that nothing happened to you guys, right? But do you sometimes think that maybe a better approach would have been to leave the kids here and then go on her own? Or I don't really know what's the right answer, but does that sometimes cross your mind?
It's so interesting you ask that, because it has never crossed my mind. I've never questioned her decision making or her rationale. One thing I honestly question more is my dad leaving us so much when he was younger, and leaving my mum with 3 little kids to go back and forth to do the filming. So whenever I reflect on it, I always think, why did he do that? That was a big risk to him, that he obviously left mum alone for lots of periods over that 2 or 3 years, like 6 months. And that's something I remember as a kid, is the times that he left and then when he came back. So I've never questioned mum's decision, and I don't think I would. I really feel like she would not have put us at risk if she thought she was, and that she would have made a calculated decision at all stages. But my reflection more is on my dad. It's like, why did he do that? But he obviously felt so passionate about a cause that, and I have to say, like, if I think to when I went to Manus, I had a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and I was pregnant. And I still went to Manus because at the time in end of 2017, when the Manus Island Detention Centre was not legal anymore, but the men were still there, and we knew we needed people in the West to go and bear witness. And so I went and I did that, and we had to get smuggled into Manus under like this old mattress on a boat. And we still did that. And I sort of now think back
So
and I'm like, oh, was
you
that the
didn't
best
fly to
idea?
Manus, but
So
you-
we flew to Manus, but then the only way that you could get to the detention centre was across the water because the roads were all being guarded. So you could only get there
right, yep.
by that boat.
Right.
So it wasn't too far, but it was still,
Yep.
you know, there were patrols there were people visibly with guns. So I think that they're sorts of decisions that you just, you know,
Yeah, you
make the
just
best
make, yep.
decision that time
Yep.
and something that you believe in
Yep.
so much. And if you think it's going to make a difference, then you do.
Yeah, but also, you know, when you're in a situation where, you know, you could actually make an impact on, you know, so many other people's lives, or, you know, where you would probably make a, you know, decision
Selfless,
like
yeah,
that, you
feel
know,
like, yeah.
selfless way of thinking about things as well, you know. Tell us more about the your work in Manus Island. You just mentioned it briefly. So this was part of the refugee advocacy work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I've been at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre for 13 years, so quite a long time. And my role there is really looking at, while ASRC provides direct services to people who need them, the only reason we exist is because people's rights are denied. They either don't have the right to work on their visa, or they're not allowed to access any level of income support. They've been waiting for 10 years. They've been separated from family, or they've been in detention and they're let out of detention and they can't access support services. So ASRC exists to provide that direct service delivery. But we also know that the only way that we would stop existing is by changing the system. So my role is very much leading that change. Some of it's through lobbying, through media, through going and talking to people, through policy and law reform. And as part of that, obviously, what's happening on Papua New Guinea and Nauru in terms of people who sought safety on our shores and then were sent offshore was absolute denial of their liberty and their rights. And one of our big aims is for there to be an end to offshore processing, and also for anyone who is subject to offshore processing to have permanency in resettlement. So at the time in 2017, when it was a very tense time where the Manus Detention Centre was no longer recognised as a detention facility, and the men were told they needed to move to other compounds and they didn't want to, that it was really hard to get information out. So we came together as a sector, and I think Amnesty did a visit, then Get Up did a visit, and then we did one as ASRC, just wanting to be able to put a spotlight on what was happening there and just to show the brutality that was being funded for and was the idea of the Australian government, like it was an intentional policy. So that was the sort of motive behind it. So we went with a videographer who could document it, but we also went with a caseworker to make sure that the individuals who we were speaking to, that then we had a caseworker who was a social worker who could document their individual needs, and we could follow up with that afterwards. So that was part of advocacy work through ASRC, that trip.
Going back to your visits to Pakistan and in Afghanistan as a kid, you described what you saw, but then do you sort of remember what was going through your head and how you were interpreting all of those things as a 7-year-old in the conversations between you and your mom and your siblings as to what they were? It's really interesting because, for instance, someone like myself, I come from Afghanistan. That was the reality that we were faced with. So we just thought that this is something that we have to work through, and we did. Some couldn't make it out, some did. But for someone like yourself who went through there from the liberty of, and comfort of Australia, what was it like? What's going through your head? How were you?
As much as you can remember as a 7-year-old.
much as- yeah.
I actually have a very, very good memory. And a lot of it, I have a 7-year-old now. And so I think before I had a 7-year-old, you think, 7's so young, they're just a kid, what do they know? But now if I think of my own 7-year-old, like she has got this incredible capacity to know right and wrong, to have empathy and sympathy for people. And I think I had similar traits because it was so obvious to me that what was happening in Afghanistan and the treatment of people from Afghanistan was wrong. Like, I remember being shocked at people counting a grain of rice because I'd never even thought about not having a next meal coming from Australia. I mean, we always, you don't ever think what would happen or how it would be to be that hungry. So at that time, I remember thinking, my goodness, like what's this situation? I never would have thought of that, going to school and the next meal. So that was one thing that really struck me, was that people don't have enough to eat, that they have to count each grain of rice that they're getting. And also just seeing, I mean, it was very vivid. We went into a tank that was captured. There were mujahideen who were there, a lot of men who were having meetings who had AK-47s and Kalashnikovs. I mean, it's not normal for a kid to be around so many guns. So, I mean, we knew, I remember being very vividly aware of what was happening and what was right and wrong.
Yep.
And now when I look at my 7-year-old, for example, like I think that would be the same. Like, she talks about at the moment, she always the big thing she questions is homelessness. She's always saying, I can't believe why people are homeless. Why can't we just, pay for them for accommodation all the time? So I think as we get older, you forget the incredible curiosity and intelligence that younger kids have. And I think that's what I had as a 7-year-old. And maybe when your son gets to 7, you'll know that too. But I did a long time. I thought, did I really remember those things, or have I seen a photo and that's what made me remember it, or was I told a story? But there are things that I raise even with mum, and she's like, wow, I can't believe you remember that. And I just think that the capacity of young people with the mind that is so curious and so empathetic. And the other thing is, like, at 7, my daughter thinks she can solve homelessness by just giving everyone a house. I probably thought, we can just solve all this division and hatred and poor treatment of people from Afghanistan that the Russians are doing. Like, I think that's where the difference is. You think that there are solutions and you're much more positive, whereas as we get older, we probably focus on the negative, or you see the problem, you don't see the solution. But I absolutely have really vivid memories about what was right, what was wrong, about the fact that I was so lucky to be born in a country where I didn't have to face any of this. I knew it was really different, but it was something that, it was very real.
Oh, wow.
But that's very interesting, because when I think back about when I was 7-year-old, similar story in terms of going from one place to another. We had to leave Afghanistan the first time the Taliban took over. This is in the early 90s. So went to Pakistan as refugees. We crossed the same border that you would have crossed into Afghanistan. We crossed it outside Afghanistan in Peshawar. And so I was in Peshawar from the age of 4 until the age of 9, and would have been there around that 7-year-old age too. And I vividly remember things that were happening, and then I knew that my family has been displaced, and this is not our home, and I knew that we were refugees, and so all of that. So I can relate to what you were saying in terms of that empathy. Of knowing and understanding where you are, and what these people are actually going through. Before we're talking about Manus Island, and that's really close to my heart, because as someone who worked in the detention center as a interpreter, translator, but also having so many friends who came to Australia as asylum seekers, some who managed to get here before the offshore processing. Some did not. Primary school friends of mine were actually inside the detention center, and I was working in the same detention center as a translator. So it was so difficult for me to be in that position where at times I thought to myself, I'm like, I'm working here and earning money, getting paid. And the reason I'm getting paid is because these people are in detention center, one of whom is a friend of mine. And I'm so glad to hear that Nauru is now 0.
Nearly
0.
Nearly.
What's happening with Manus? Do you know, are people, how many people are still stuck there? What's the what does the avenue look like for those that are still there?
Yeah, so I'll just close off on the Nauru bit first. So it's down to 12 people who are on Nauru, and expecting that all 12 will be evacuated to Australia by the end of June, so within the next 2 weeks. So that will be a huge moment to celebrate. As you've articulated, you were there and you saw what happened. It's 10 years of a absolutely rotten policy where we sent people into detention systems, and people were lucky to have guys like you translating who can understand them, but it still doesn't take away from the fact that they were in a place that they didn't deserve to be in and shouldn't have been. So it's been very clear from the Australian government the policy of getting the number of people on Nauru to 0 with the new Albanese government elected last year. So this is them honouring that, and that is great, and we will celebrate it when it happens. Unfortunately, there's not the same clear policy direction for people on PNG. There's no one on Manus anymore. I think there might be a couple of guys who are there because they've married local women and they wanted to make their life there. But overall, there are 82 refugees who are still in Papua New Guinea, the vast majority who are in Port Moresby and who want to be evacuated because they're either waiting for a pathway to New Zealand, to Canada or to the US. But I'm sure that you saw the mental and physical health deterioration of people years ago when you were there. Imagine like 10 whole years of that. No one is well after being subjected to 10 years of offshore processing and a detention regime such as they have. So that the 82 who were there, we are really urging the government to apply a same policy direction urgently so that the 82 can come to Australia, and those who want to, who haven't rebuilt their life there, can come to Australia so that they can have that safe permanency and safe pathway and resettlement option. So it really is interesting that the Australian government is treating Nauru and Papua New Guinea so differently when they both start off with the same purpose. I understand, the Australian government's line is that regional processing in Papua New Guinea was found to be illegal by the Papua New Guinean government, so nothing to see. But, people arrived on our shores seeking our safety. We sent them to Papua New Guinea as we did to Nauru. We paid for it. So it is our responsibility and duty of care. You can pull some kind of technicality if you want, but morally the responsibility is ours, and so we should take the same approach to Papua New Guinea as to Nauru. So obviously 82 is a lot less than 1,000 who were there, but it's still 82 too many.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. And so what work exactly is ARC? I'm aware of what work that ARC has been doing, but for everyone else who's watching this, you've mentioned that you went and traveled there, documented what was going on there, but also can you go a little bit more into the specific cases of people who ARC has actually worked on?
Without obviously identifying.
Of course. So we obviously there are people seeking asylum in the community in Australia who are here from various countries and who arrived in different ways. So just to take the example of what we're doing for those in Papua New Guinea and Nauru, so we have a legal team who are legally representing people from Papua New Guinea, refugees who've been sent to Papua New Guinea and Nauru, which means helping with their claim for asylum, so whether or not they're found to be a refugee, because obviously you need a lawyer to navigate that, for trying to force the Australian government to move them to Australia, to medically evacuate them if they need them. So that's the legal work we're doing. We also have a detention rights advocacy program, which are the caseworkers, one of who came with us when we went to Manus, as I'd mentioned, and they are on the phone every day to the men who are still in Nauru and Papua New Guinea and just offering triage casework and social work service. And a lot of the time it's for people who are calling and saying things are so bad, I'm thinking of either self-harming or I don't know what to do, I can't contact my family, and it's just someone at the end of the phone to provide that psychosocial support through our detention program. Where I work is then we are constantly trying to get the government to change their position. So we'll have a petition that we'll get people to sign, then we'll take that to the government. We'll request meetings with the various ministers. We'll get an imminent risk notification from the caseworkers saying, look, this person is in such an awful situation because they may have diabetes, for example, they can't get treated properly, so then it compounds. I mean, there have been 14 people who've lost their lives because of offshore processing. One who lost his life because he had a cut on his foot, didn't get treated, then got sepsis and died. So we try and provide that. So that's sort of from a legal point of view, a casework point of view, and then advocacy and lobbying. Also trying to get the public to take pressure, because we know that the government, whichever it is of the day, will only take action if they're pressured to, as we saw when Djokovic came here and there were people in hotel detention and we got a groundswell of support, and then everyone was released from hotel detention. Ahead of the election, Morrison government accepted the New Zealand deal to resettle people in New Zealand, and that all only happened because of public pressure.
Yeah.
So that's other part of what we do.
That's the work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. We also do provide that direct services, because it might be, and we'll just take an example of people from Afghanistan who fled because they were persecuted by the Taliban, then are in Australia but living in the community. They might have flown in because they might have been able to escape to Pakistan, then have flown in, and so then we'll help them when they're in the community with also having that legal access to navigate being found to be a refugee, being recognised as a refugee, but also if they need housing support or food or medicine, because I think one thing people don't realise is that depending on when you arrived and how you arrived and what stage you're at with your visa, you may or may not have basic rights, such as right to work or right to Medicare.
Yeah.
There are so many gaps in the system.
It's such a it's such a messy process or system. One that it largely depends on your luck as to who you get, even as your immigration caseworker or processing officer that processes your case. Secondly, on the guys that were in detention, overall detention. The worst thing about it, well, there's the conditions of it, the living conditions of it as well. And then the second was the unknown, the fear, the factor of unknown. And then if you were to get someone from the boat and say, all right, you're going to be in detention for 5 years, and then 5 years in the first day, you're going to be out to the community. I don't think that would have been as detrimental as the not knowing how long it's going to be. So there was that. And then you couple that with all the ups and downs that you go through with your legal cases with the government, right? You get rejected and you appeal it, and there's so many. And I'm sure you're in the thick of it, right? You know very well.
Absolutely.
It was just such a messy. It still is such a messy system, and I can't believe it actually even exists. But yeah, so the work that you and ASRC are doing is extremely valuable.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
and someone particularly who benefited from the services of ASRC myself back in 2011 you would have worked there at the time.
I was there still then.
And also, in my capacity as an interpreter, I worked here and there for ASRC, but also helped a lot of my friends seek asylum seeker help. A lot of my close friends whom I referred took to the ASRC office back when you guys were in the city, but also when after you moved to Footscray, and it was so heartwarming to see people come to ASRC and have food lunch there. Those that wanted to go have free grocery from their shop and all that work. When I found out that ASRC was going through serious financial hardship, it actually really was emotional for me, because it brought up all those memories. I'm like, an organization like this has to stay, but a little bit of I guess what made it if I can finish on this point, sure. What made it difficult for me was to see that not necessarily within our community, the Hazara Australian community, there wasn't enough support or enough advocacy to actually give back or support ASRC. And as someone who is the director of advocacy there, what message do you have for our audience, for a lot of Hazara Australians who might be watching this, those that either themselves or indirectly other people around them benefited from the services of ASRC? I personally feel like it's our turn now. It's time to actually be giving more, supporting ASRC more. What message as the director do you have for our audience?
Look, I think it's a really important point that you do raise. I feel that, especially with the Hazara community, there's still so much grieving that many members of the Hazara community are going through in Australia, that many are still separated from family, seeing the situation that's unfolding in Afghanistan, knowing that Hazaras continue to be targeted and persecuted. I can understand why some might not have as their first priority or think about what's happening to ASRC. So I can understand that. So the first thing I would say, my message would be just to find out more, just to equip themselves with knowledge of what's happening, perhaps even coming and volunteering at ASRC as a way to do it. I know everyone's not necessarily in a financial situation, but talk to yourselves, talk to others, and really that value that ASRC provides to the community that you've articulated exactly what. But it's one thing for me to say it, and it's one thing for you to say it. So I actually think the message is more powerful when it comes from within the community, because I don't want to be seen as really insensitive, saying, "Oh, why don't you donate to ASRC?" And someone might say, "Well, I don't even have a permanent visa." So I understand why you want me to answer that question, and I do think that. I mean, I see it even within the Italian community. Like it's we've got such a huge diaspora in Australia, so many second and third generation who sort of tend to focus on what it was like when they came, and sometimes that's where we get the most resistance to new waves of migration are from previous migrants who sort of think, well, I had it bad as well, I've got to focus on myself. So I think it's just about general education. It's about talking much more and asking questions. I think that's one thing that, Anglo-Australia doesn't like debate, doesn't like openness, doesn't like having those hard conversations, but we need to have it because we are a multicultural community. We are built on migrants, and we should always, if we've come as migrants, we should always make sure that things are better for the next wave of migrants, whether it's you're seeking asylum or you're a refugee or a migrant. And I think Australia's got such a poor history of I mean, look at how we treat First Nations people, let alone, new waves of migrants. So I know it probably hasn't answered in as much articulation as you want.
I think that you've answered really well, in fact. The way I think about ASRC or organizations like ASRC, I don't, whenever, I volunteer or don't donate to ASRC is... I think about them as ASRC doesn't actually need my donations, but it's the who I'm donating to is the works and the services that ASRC provide to. So in past years, it's been directly our community, or at least a portion of our community has been the beneficiary of the ASRC's services, right? And then on the other topic where you were saying that there isn't really a lot of reception to dialogue is precisely the reason that Hash and I created this forum, this podcast, is because we find that in this day and age, the left and the right are becoming their philosophies about what's right and wrong is more and more stretched a distance from one another, and so if you and I don't believe any side, and I don't blame any of the sides. So if you're constantly exposed to Sky News and Alan Jones on your way to work and back, naturally your ideas and will be shaped as such. On the other hand, if you live in Fitzroy and all the information that you are exposed to are ABC or the likes of ABC, then you're going to be culturally, Cairns to Melbourne, Australia is like two different countries. And part of the reason is because, as you said, there isn't enough dialogue there. So hope with Qissa podcast, we hope to chip away at chunks at a time to try and sort of make that difference, or at least facilitate that dialogue a little bit. So in sticking with that theme is you've got our community, or Afghan diaspora, or the Syrian diaspora, or the Iranian, or these relatively conservative people who've migrated from their countries and have come. and they benefited from the ideas of the let's call it left, pro-refugee supporters, and naturally, so it helped them through voting and whatnot, advocacies, and now they are settled here, and they have to decide on who to vote for now, right? Because they're Australian citizens and whatnot. But what's happening is that their values that they were raised with, or the values that they follow, is at times directly opposite to the values of people who supported them in the first place. So the way I see that, so you've got people who've come from these conservative backgrounds. They've come from deciding on arranged marriages to now having to vote on things like marriage on same sex, transgender rights, and to them it's going to be through the conservative approach that they were raised with. This is a complete no-no to them. So I guess from a supportive point of view, I know that ASRC or organizations like ASRC don't discriminate now, but I guess it's more for political groups such as the Greens, the Labour, and things like that. But through the exposure that you have with these parties, these political parties, do you sort of see people talking about this, that if we support them now through the values that they have, it's almost screaming Bob Carter, or it's screaming Pauline Hanson, and the only thing that doesn't really align with Bob Carter or Pauline Hanson is the support on refugee bit, but everything else aligns with their values. Have you heard such dialogue in formal, informal, through the political exposure that you've had with these parties?
I haven't had formal dialogue with them about it, but I do think that the political parties are becoming more aware to the nuances, especially in multicultural communities. But I mean, if you have a look at our parliament, it is predominantly Anglo that doesn't reflect Australian community. I mean, you look even in the Liberal Party, there aren't as many women. So the fact that our politicians aren't reflecting or representing the country, I think I saw Peter Khalil, who's my local member in Coburg, had done some research and showed that it was less than 10% of the Australian Parliament are people who are from a non-Anglo-European background.
Yep.
So that means Anglo or Italian or Greek, but he, from Egyptian background, is one of a small minority. So I think that there are some conversations starting to happen, but until our parliament and our elected representatives start to represent the broader community, then those nuances, I mean, I'm sure that nuances in communities such as in Di Lee's community, she's the independent member in Sydney, she can see that. She's come from a multicultural background, and, she is from a family of refugees, but she also, on the other side, has probably some more conservative values.
Yep.
So I think that we are not progressed enough as a country to first of all reconcile with our history and what we did to First Nations people, to then look at how we are treating migrants and refugees and those nuances there, that yes, someone can be compassionate towards refugees, but then they may not believe in marriage equality. I just don't think that we are sophisticated enough in our debate and our dialogue. I think some are starting to do it, but we're not necessarily doing it far enough. And it is interesting because it's some of those values that are very conflicting.
Yes.
But if you go back to the value, and this is one we try and tap into, take the politics out of it. Because, I mean, there are people within the Liberal Party who are more progressive on refugee issues than some people in the Labor Party. Like, it depends on your values. I mean, have a look at Malcolm Fraser. He refused to engage in narratives about boats, and we resettled 250,000 people from the Vietnam War. He was a Liberal Prime Minister versus, offshore processing was then brought in under Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd. Yes. So I try and focus very much on it's not about left and right, it's about right and wrong. And if you appeal to those values, like, do you believe everyone should be treated fairly? I don't have many people that say, oh, no, I think we should be unfair. Like, if you think two people should be treated equally. So I actually do think we need to go back to more conversations about values. Yep. We need to also talk about difference. This difference is not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if you judge someone by it.
Yes.
But it's good to have robust debates because pretty much with anyone you can find those crossovers in values that are common, and then you can build from that point. And I think that that's where we're not. And I'm not sure if this is the Anglo side in it, but it's like, I have conversations with my Italian family and you debate about politics, you debate about religion, about death. It's very fiery. Whereas in around an election, people don't want to talk about who they vote for. They don't want to talk about, how much money they have. Like there's something in this Anglo society that doesn't value debate or difference. And that's where we need to get to.
I see what you mean.
So I think that we're not there yet, and we need to be. And I think especially in the left and progressive left, sort of not talking about that and just thinking, oh, well, you came here as a refugee means you're going to support every progressive cause. That's short-sighted.
Yes. That's a really interesting take on it as well. The other thing I was going to talk about is maybe you weren't, because of your, the line of work or the characteristics that your dad had and your family had, maybe you didn't have extreme exposure or as much of an exposure on what it was like as an Italian to be settling into Australia and see that cultural evolution, throughout the generations develop and evolve. But where the Afghan diaspora is at the moment in Australia, we are basically at the same, probably about similar stage as to what your dad was when he came to Australia. So, the book Looking for Alibrandi, we've got, thousands of Alibrandis in Australia at the moment going through the exact same sort of processes that Alibrandi went and those cultural challenges. So fully appreciate that the Italian culture is probably a lot closer to because it's in the West to the Australian culture as an overall, but still it's a different culture on its own. So can you sort of although I know that you understand that you're also not Afghan, or although you've got information about Afghanistan and the community here in Australia, can you sort of see or give a little bit of highlight as to where the Italians went and did really well, and where you saw some social challenges as the culturally the people evolved? Maybe not, as I said, maybe you didn't experience it yourself because your family was a little bit different to what a typical Italian might have been. But think about, an Italian family in Carlton that resettled, those many years ago, and their families evolved, their kids went to school, and, how they sort of kept it together.
Look, it is interesting, and I can even reflect on, thinking of two examples. Like, I remember Dad always telling us that because he and Mum got married overseas, that when he arrived in Australia for the first time, how awful immigration were to him, and they pulled him aside and they were saying, oh, you tricked some Australian woman into marrying you just so you could come here. So that he experienced that racism being an Italian in the 70s coming into Australia. We grew up in Maryborough in a small country town, and there was not a lot of multicultural families. There was an Asian family who ran the Chinese restaurant. There was an Aboriginal family. There were a couple of Italian families, but we were teased and called wogs, especially because, I remember my brother and I, like, our eyebrows joined, and that was always seen as a wog. We were teased as that. There was another Italian family who had the Italian restaurant in town. So we even felt different from that. Whereas now I look at it, I mean, my daughter's name's Raffaella, my other daughter's Artemisia, my son is Costantino.
And these are Italian
They're
names.
Italian names, but they would never be teased for their Italianness.
Yes.
So I can even see from my experience growing up 40 years ago to my dad's then entering Australia 50 years ago, things have changed. And we were sort of probably more fortunate because we're fair and we're blue-eyed, so we didn't look so different. I think it's that real proximity to whiteness, like how kind of white or Anglo you look in Australia is how accepted you are. So for my kids, I mean, they've got my surname as well, Favero, so they've got an Italian name, but no one would even blink twice or tease them like I got teased or my dad got teased. So I can only imagine what it was like for the Italians, especially who migrated after World War II, because of a lot more was because of poverty, and they were really working class, and they went into the lower paid jobs. How difficult it would have been for them. Probably didn't speak English. Like my dad came to Australia speaking English. He came already married. It was really interesting. And then I look at my brother, his wife. She's Peruvian.
Yep.
And it was so she's got an MBA. Like they met doing their MBA at Stanford. She could not get a job in Australia when she first moved here.
Yep.
They would not recognise the Peruvian wedding certificate because they thought it was a scam. They had to then get married in Australia as well. So the layers of racism and discrimination in Australia still exist. It just changes who it's targeted at. So I think it was probably much more towards Europeans, towards Greeks and Italians, and now as Greeks and Italians are seeing more of that, proximity to whiteness, and that it's now targeted more sort of
Middle Eastern.
Asian, Middle Eastern. And I mean, just have a look at incarceration rates in Australia. Like there are more young of African descent black men disproportionately in prison. Like there's still racial profiling, there's still targeting, and it's just happening. It's just applying to people of different skin colour as it changes. So we need to have a conversation about racism in Australia. We only ended the White Australia policy in the 50s and 60s because we needed more people to come into work. Like I have no doubt now the only reason why so many visas are granted and we really have as much multiculturalism is because we need workers in Australia, rather than embracing it and celebrating and saying this is what makes our country great. And this is again that we need to talk about diversity for the benefits of diversity and how amazing it is. Like I remember going to a talk once thinking about how to talk to your kids about race, because I was always wondering, like my kids would point out someone who had black skin and I was always like, don't say that, don't, everyone looks the same. But actually you should point out difference. It's good to see difference and celebrate it. It's just what you do with that difference. So I have no idea if this is answering your question or if it's on a different track.
No, it is, yeah.
But I just think that we need to have a conversation about racism within Australia. We need to talk about it. We need to confront it, because that's the only way that we'll move on from it. And again, going back to it's only been begrudging apologies. We've got the vote for the referendum to recognise Aboriginal people in the Constitution, and it's looking like that's not a certainty that will pass, because
You're talking about the voice.
I'm talking about the voice, that there's still division, and I absolutely understand that there are some no vote or hesitation within Aboriginal communities. That's different to the racist no vote that we've got that Peter Dutton is leading.
Yes.
And the fact that we've still got people who will say, I'm not voting yes because I don't want Aboriginal people to be able to have a greater voice. I mean, that is racism.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, because I think there is a lack of awareness from what I'm observing amongst our community, being the Hazara Australians, about this referendum coming up. I think it would be important for us to talk about that a bit, particularly because I personally feel it's a significant event in the Australian history. For first time recognizing, it might not be the perfect change that we need, but it is a step towards that. About that referendum, if you could perhaps talk about how it all evolved and what stage we were in, and then even about the I think it's coming up in October, isn't it? The actual
October or November, they haven't landed. And look, I actually think you probably need to devote a whole podcast to this, and with someone who is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, because they can then represent the First Nations perspective. From my lens of equality and recognition, and it is absolutely a package of voice, treaty and truth. It needs to be all of those. It's not just one thing. But what I see, and I've heard from Aboriginal people have told me and encouraged me to vote yes, is because of the significance of this moment in time and the momentum that we'll be able to follow if and when the yes vote gets up. Because just imagine being a First Nations person and then not having the majority of the country voting for you to have an equal voice or to have a voice will be absolutely devastating. So also consequences of the yes vote not getting up, which would be absolutely disastrous. And I really firmly believe in that, and because that is what First Nations people are telling me. But I really think that you should devote a whole
I agree with that,
podcast to it, because I don't want to represent, something that's not my lived experience, but it's certainly, I know also in multicultural communities there's confusion because Peter Dutton's done that. He's saying, oh, well, refugees aren't getting a voice, migrants aren't getting a voice. So trying to,
scare campaign. Yeah.
It's absolutely scare campaign. Like we always know that we should be talking about what unifies us, not trying to divide us. And that's exactly what Peter Dutton's done. He's done it before with even pitting refugee against a person seeking asylum, different groups of migrants. Like they are trying to intentionally divide us. It's a tactic that the right uses to try and get their way and to sow a seed of doubt. But we need to come together and we need to be unified in this moment and not believe or listen to that dog whistling and that fear and racism, which is about trying to divide us. They'll use fear and division every time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll definitely have a podcast about this, perhaps maybe closer to the date, to encourage some awareness in the community about this topic. It's interesting we're talking about it because last night I was talking to my sister-in-law, who precisely encouraged me to actually have a podcast about this, and that got me thinking. Great. Any other topic that you want to talk about? Or
that's it from my end. Yeah.
Such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for taking your time, coming to our studio. I'm sure there will be, sitting down again, at some point in the future.
Yeah, very happy to always chat. You can tell I like to talk, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right.